G'day. Um, we're moving on to chapter 1 in business law, and as I do these videos, I'm going to do a typical lecture with these PowerPoint videos. May or may not be helpful. For a lot of people, they are kind of helpful. Go through, I tend to stress important things, things that you guys ought to maybe spend a little bit more time on and make sure that you understand for the tests. Might help you with the assignments, etc. But it's kind of optional. Some people maybe don't need them to learn. If I'm going to do other announcements, those types of things, I'll probably send those out on a separate video, a separate link, and those would tend to be more mandatory. Things that I want to talk about the class. I may, into the discussions a couple weeks, maybe I want to change some things or see some, different submissions, different types of submissions. So I may talk about them. Okay, so those would tend to be more required. This is a little bit optional. So a couple things would remind people, however, that we do have a Business Professionals of America chapter here on campus. Lanny Wilkie is the advisor for that, and if you have any interest in joining that, and you should, looks good on the resume. They get to do some traveling and do some competing, do some good projects. Yeah, you might want to consider that, and if you do, if you're interested, talk to Lanny, or you could talk to me, and I would make the connection for you. Word conversion, there may be a number of you that don't use Word anymore. Some of the other programs are becoming popular. Sometimes D2L won't open those others for me, and that's fine. D2L is advancing too, and we may be seeing it more capable now. But you might get an email back from me, I couldn't open this or something like that. If that's the case, you may need to save your document then in a Word format. Most programs would allow that, and so you may need to do that if I request it. I would add too that while you're a student here, you can get the free Office suite through, I think you go through the bookstore, and it's free. No reason not to have it, and you can get versions that work on Windows or Apple. So I didn't talk about this, but quality of assignments. I do grade both for the content, the answers to the particular questions, but I also grade for the quality. Something that's poorly written, lots of grammatical errors, spelling errors, those types of things, I'll ding. Okay, so make sure you keep the quality of your writing adequate for these types of assignments. United States is a nation of law, or laws. Typically, is what I've seen, is that should be plural. I'll have to look that up and see what John Adams actually said. But we are a nation of laws, and what's that mean? Well, it means we don't have a king that just changes his or her mind, king or queen that changes his or her mind on a whim, right? Instead, we have a document in place by which we run our country and administer things and set forth things. And that's actually an extremely important thing. You'll hear politicians probably talk about that even during this election cycle. Law, the rule of law, property right. We have to have these things for a successful country. In order for the country to grow and prosper, we have to have those things. People that know me might call me kind of conservative, meaning I stand for lesser government. Typically, however, I would tell you that a limited and strong government is extremely important. If we can't enforce contracts, if we can't do those types of things, if we don't have property rights and those types of things, we will not be successful. Okay, and we see that around the world. And so, while I believe in a little less government, the government that we should have, needs to be strong and needs to be able to enforce those things. I think later we'll get to what the rule of law is. So the law is the rules by society, right? Rules of society. created by the state. In our case, to a certain extent, created by the people, right? We elect representatives that go and vote on our behalf, but we also have initiatives in our state where we can pass things and change things, right? And they're enforced to create confidence. We would not enter into contracts and do those types of things if we didn't know that we could enforce those in the courts, unless we thought we could enforce those ourselves. Learning objectives, okay. So different theories as to why nations are weak or strong. I think the dependency theory is that some nations have a dependency on other nations, and the people maybe within those nations depend upon the nation to provide and those types of things, which makes them relatively weak. Natural resources nations can prosper for reasonable periods of time because they have natural resources. Education and technology can be very helpful. Climate, of course, Hawaii has a pretty good tourist trade because people like to go to Hawaii because it's warm in the winter, right? But the most important of these is a modern private market, right? And a law and a legal system to enforce those things. If you look at some nations around the world, Singapore might be a good example. Chile is becoming a good example, and a few others. Japan was for a time, okay, but they had these principles, and it made those nations has made those nations very, very strong. And I say Singapore because Singapore doesn't have any natural resources, education and technology, nothing special in the climate, right? But it has these things, and as a result, it's very successful. I think it may have the highest per capita income in the world, okay, for basically a large city. The rule of law says this: the laws are made generally and equally applicable. So generally encompasses people, encompasses areas. They're general and open to interpretation also. Okay, might be a couple of definitions for generally. Equally applicable means that nobody's above the law. All right, so we're going to apply these equally. Laws can differ from jurisdictions, though. Havre has a law against cell phone usage while you're driving. Other communities in Montana do not have a similar law. Okay, some states have laws that ban cell phone usage while you're driving on state highways. Montana does not have that. Okay. There you go. Better definition than what I gave. By the way, no doubt on the quiz and on the test. Law's role, right, or where does law come from? It kind of comes from a combination of some of these things, right? But it's one of the things that holds our society together, is having a reasonable law. And when you think about the United States, and of course there's turmoil going on now with Black Lives Matter, some of those other things, Colin Kaepernick saying you won't stand for the national anthem and things like that, okay, you have to remember too that the United States is perhaps, if not the most diverse, probably one of the most diverse nations in the whole world, okay. We truly are the melting pot of all races and national people of different national origins, etc. And yet we actually exist pretty well together, despite what you read in the headline news all the time. Okay, it makes news, and it's horrible when those things happen. But the truth is, we live pretty well together, especially given our diversity. Again, the importance of enforcement, and I've already kind of hit on that. We have to have that. Without adequate enforcement, the certainty and trust just isn't there. Probably going to be on quizzes, tests. There you go. Almost all wealthy countries embrace the rule of law. The exceptions there might be those nations that, again, have significant natural resources, and they're able to be wealthy, in spite of that. So what is the rule of law? That laws are made generally and equally applicable, right? Were you impacted by the law on the way to class today? Say yeah. Okay, that we're impacted by the law every waking moment and even in our sleeping moments, right? Or in those moments we wish we were sleeping. I'll give you an example. Last night at 12:04 a.m., I know because I checked my watch, the neighbor or somebody that was parking in front of the neighbor's house was out there with music blaring, loud enough to probably wake people 2 blocks away. And of course it's summer and it's nice, and so we have the windows open so it's easy to hear, and that wakes me up. Um, you know, was it reason to call the cops? No. It subsided after about 10 minutes, but certainly I could have. Certainly it was a nuisance. Yes, they have property rights. They have rights to be there, and probably no matter the time and whatnot, but they also have to respect our rights, to peaceful and quiet enjoyment of our residents. And so, we're always impacted by the laws just about no matter what we're doing, what day of the week it is or time of the day, whatever. Nations, yeah. Law applies to lawmakers as well as the rest of society. This is interesting because there will certainly be some exceptions with our Congress. Our Congress exempts themselves from a lot of laws. I sometimes find that troubling, and I wish it wasn't that way. But although certainly lawmakers, I guess, and maybe I'll backtrack on that, because the lawmakers are subject mostly to the same laws, meaning that, yeah, the Congress itself is exempt from a lot of the laws, but if that lawmaker leaves, even though he's a congressperson and he's speeding down the road, he's subject to a speeding fine or a DUI or any other type of enforcement, just as you or I would. So the lawmakers themselves are subject pretty much to the laws, but the body, Congress, has exempted itself from some things. Property, and we spend a whole chapter on properties, actually 2 chapters on property, so I won't get into it a lot at this point in time, but owners, it gives us the right to possess, transfer, right, prevent interference, and it's a basis for the private market. Again, we'll get into that more in depth. So it's a legal fence, right? Keeps others out by announcing private ownership and enforcing it. So we have those rights. Okay. They're individual, they're based in the Constitution. It excludes the state from interference, and it's kind of synonymous with what we call liberty here in the United States, or these particular property rights. Now, it excludes the state from interference, but there's exceptions, obviously, right? We have zoning. We have conditions, or restrictive covenants is the word I was looking for, that can be on property that the government enforces, and there are other rules then that can be enforced. The nuisance thing that I talked about, right? Just because I own the property, it doesn't mean that I can set off explosives or have Deep Purple. That's an old rock band for those of you that are too young, which is probably all of you, but I can't have them over to my house at 2 in the morning playing a concert, okay, at full blast, because that would probably disturb my neighbors, okay, and so there are exceptions to that, of course. Yeah, that was just an article I thought was kind of cool. Owners can keep others from interfering through police and courts. What the article here was about, there was a article in the newspaper a year or so ago, and it talked about the bar in Carter, Montana. For those of you that have driven from Great Falls to Havre, you know where Carter, Montana is, and there's a little bar it's been alternately open and closed for the last several years. And supposedly the new owners had contemplated opening up a strip joint there. Well, the people of Carter took exception to that. They didn't want a strip joint located in their quiet little town, and maybe rightfully so. And so there was some protesting and whatnot going on, and again, rightfully so. And it never came to be. The owner did not open up a strip joint, and so we never had to find out through the courts or whatnot what might have been possible or what might not have. But those are issues that do come up on any of these things. So property rights, though, do provide incentive for development, right? You're more inclined to want to develop on your property if you own it, You know, if it's free and belong, or not necessarily free and clear, but if it belongs to you, you have a lot of incentive to develop and improve and make that property worth more. You know, whether it's mowing around your house or planting flowers or something, or if you have business property, you want to profit from that, right? You don't want to just let it sit there and pay the taxes on it, right? You have an incentive to get going. So, again, Western culture and wealthy nations tend to prosper because of recognition of property rights. Um, Property is not just real property. That's oftentimes what we think about it, but it's a lot more broad, right? Okay, that's basically saying the same thing. I would go back and add, though, the property or other things. We can own a patent, for example. The case that I have, the discussion that I have with Mylan has to do with the patent. And, you know, the company that owns it, Mylan, and the value of that and what they're charging for it and all those other things. And that's a certain property, too, or copyrights. You know, singers write songs and they have copyright. They're entitled to compensation when that song's played. When it's played for money, at least, they're entitled to some compensation. So property is other things besides just real property. Ways that we can acquire resources. Again, we get into these in far more detail when we get to the property. I don't know that a lot of these would be on the first test. Yeah, I mean, what James Madison had said here, right? Property in its larger and juster meaning embraces everything which a man may attach value, to which a man may attach value and have a right. So, not just real property, but other things, vehicles, you know, four-wheelers, skateboards, whatever the case may be, right? Jurisprudence has some history, philosophies, right, that have helped establish our jurisprudence, I guess. You know, the natural laws of nature have had a impact. Positive law. I'd have to go back and look. I don't even remember that one myself. But historical school, you know, what's come down through the ages. Sociological, you know, what society or society factors have an impact on that. And then legal realism, what's possible, what can we do. In some cases, it may be very much, and in some cases, very little. Okay. Your assignment talks about this, right? There's civil law, which you'll hear me refer to oftentimes as statutory law, and common law, you'll hear me refer to oftentimes as case law. Okay. Civil law or statutory law are laws that are made. Okay. Our Constitution was ultimately passed, and many laws are on the books subsequent, you know, either set up by Congress, states, local. Okay. Local laws are oftentimes called codes or ordinances. Okay, codes or ordinances, that might be on the test. Okay, common law is case law that gets established because of rulings that courts have made, and let me give you a few examples of that. If you get arrested, what do the cops do? They read you your Miranda rights. Okay, Miranda rights didn't really emanate from legislators passing laws or whatever. A guy named Miranda got arrested. Okay, he fought, you know, he battled back, and he said, wait a minute, you know, I wasn't informed of any rights. You know, I wasn't told, you know, that I was entitled to a lawyer. I wasn't told of any of those things. Okay, and so in Miranda v. Arizona, the courts actually came back and said, you know, Miranda, you're right. You should be entitled to know those things when a officer of the law, officer of the state arrests you. And subsequently, people then are read their rights. I've seen it on TV shows since for the last 50 or 60 years. Okay, and that's an example. Another example might be Roe v. Wade, which made it possible for women to have abortions. Right? Again, most of the law at the time, in fact, prohibited women from having abortions, and Roe or Wade or whoever, you know, sued to have that right, and the court agreed with her, and that became law then without legislators or anybody having to pass laws. Okay, it just became law because that's how the Supreme Court ultimately ruled. Okay, and there's other examples, you know, that come down, and so law kind of gets established based on those things. Public law versus private law. Public law is those things that are, you know, you get arrested for speeding, you get arrested for disorderly conduct, for an MIP, for DUI, whatever the case may be. Okay, enforced by, again, officers of the state, officers of the law. Or can also be enforced, I should get a lot of administrative laws is public law too, like the EPA and Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Agencies like that also deal with public law. Okay, private law, on the other hand, is between individuals or entities considered as individuals, like corporations and whatnot, right? One corporation suing another corporation is an example of private law, and that's oftentimes what private law entails, is lawsuits and whatnot going back and forth against one another. Okay, and then civil law is most often private law. Okay, it's those cases that are between individuals. Okay, and criminal law is most often public law, but not always. Okay, now remember I talked about administrative agencies and those types of things. Oftentimes there can be civil actions that take place there, and we'll talk, especially when we get to I think talking about antitrust and whatnot. You know, we get two different agencies that actually enforce antitrust laws, and one, the Department of Justice, deals with the criminal side of it, and the Federal Trade Commission deals with the civil side of that and enforcing some actions there. Substantive law and procedural law. And by the way, on the last question in your assignment, I better not answer that. Some of you have that left, but I'll say this: the one part of it is a little bit confusing, and frankly, the answer the book gives me isn't what I would have said. Okay, and so I'm pretty forgiving when I'm correcting that one. Okay, the other one is kind of a no-brainer. It's definitely one of the two. So, well, I already kind of got ahead of myself and pretty much talked about those things. It does give you an idea of the nations, you know, that really have used, because it really, and a lot of you had this in your assignment, or will, that it kind of emanated here in the United Kingdom and then came our way. Civil law, on the other hand, was based. Boy, did I describe those right when I was back here? Yeah. Okay. Yep. Civil law was based more in these nations. Okay. And I probably left that out when I was describing it back here, and for that I apologize. Yeah, there are nations that we're really considered a common law nation. Okay. Even though we have lots of statutory law. Okay, and I need to explain that. Even though we have lots and lots of laws that we pass, the judiciary actually has the last word, right? And the judiciary can actually make law by having decisions like I described. Okay, that doesn't mean that we don't have statutory law. In these nations, the legislatures kind of reign supreme, meaning that they pass laws, and it's the judiciary's job simply to enforce those laws, can't overturn them. So that's kind of the difference between the two systems. I'm sorry if I was a little bit confusing about that. You'll note that civil law, French, and a lot of the civil law, that statutory type of law and whatnot, came from French. It's interesting that in the United States, if Louisiana has oftentimes, and they've pretty much come into the fold in the last 15 or 20 years or so, but often, their law was based in the civil law, or from France, and that's why they have parishes instead of counties, and their laws were different, and actually they operated differently. They were the last state to adopt a lot of common laws that the other 50 states typically adopted, like the UCC. Okay, I've kind of already talked about those things. Yep, good to know these things. Civil law can be torts and contracts, like we said. It can result in damages, but no punishment. We do have punitive damages, but that's damages up here. By punishment, they mean jail. Okay, people don't go to jail because one person sues another. Okay, if the criminal justice system gets involved, that's when people can go to jail. Again, somewhat confusing with that last question. So. Internet law is a whole new realm, right? If I write a blog, is that copyrighted? Or can other people use it, right? Fair use doctrine would say other people can use it if they're not using it to make money. Okay, binding agreements over the internet, right? Versus typical signed contracts or written contracts. Can you monitor email? Ooh, nobody was Well, I was going to say nobody was monitoring Hillary's, but then again, the Russians might have been. We don't know, but your employer can. Okay, absolutely. Your employer has every right to monitor your work email that's provided from your computer. Every right to. Okay, there's no privacy rights there, right? Rights to copies of intellectual property. Interesting, right? Yeah, intellectual property. We talk about patents and copyrights and those types of things. And so again, we'll get into those more fully later. Employers and employee discipline. What if you're blogging after work about how horrible your company is to work for? Interesting stuff, right? Regulation of the internet. This is I've seen headlines just in the last couple of days that talk about is the United States turning over regulation of its internet to international authorities? Interesting. And how is it affected by interstate commerce? And there's tax laws and whatnot that have come into play in a lot of that. ISPs, or internet service providers, liable for maybe what some of their customers do? Good question. Constitutions, right? Set forth fundamental rights, describe and empower governments. Okay, a lot of governments, probably most of them in the world, have constitutions, or a lot of nations. We certainly do. Ours is 230 some years old, or it's about 240 years old, wouldn't it be? 1776, yeah, 240 years old. Okay, sets forth some pretty specific things, right? Legislation, we know, laws by Congress, state, administrative regulation, and we spend a whole chapter talking about that. Again, I won't go into real depth, but that's, again, your Federal Trade Commission, your Federal Communications Commission, the National Weather Service. Those types of things are administrative agencies. And then judicial decisions or case law. Legislation gives us some uniformity. Right? Federal law does preempt state law, except when the Constitution says no. And there may be some examples of that. States have adopted a single law, which is called the Uniform Commercial Code. Interpretation of that is generally it's general language. And what do we mean by that? Well, the language is general, and so courts. It's left up for courts to interpret, and even sometimes when they pass laws, or Congress people, it's kind of like, I guess it's kind of like Nancy Pelosi, right? We got to pass it to see what's in it, and Congress people have said that in the past. We need to pass this, and then we'll let the courts interpret it. We need to let the cases kind of develop, and I know that sounds kind of bass-ackward, and it sounds expensive, and it is, and all those things. But sometimes it takes that, and it takes arguments and from both sides in an actual real scenario for them to determine. So then the courts interpret. Advantages of case law, which again is based on, or common law, based on decisions, right, that have been made by courts in the past. Well, stare decisis means that judges follow precedents, and it gives some certainty and predictability. If you're ever in a court case, you'll find that your side, and they might have a paralegal or the attorney's going to research cases that have been similar and use those to make their arguments that, hey, there's been a precedent established already. And tell that to the judge, so hopefully the judge would side with them. Disadvantages, all kinds of cases, right? We all know our courts are overloaded. There can be conflicting precedents from different jurisdictions and whatnot. There can be conflicts of law, right? Different laws in certain cases, right? Legal sanctions are these things. They encourage or force compliance, punishment prevention, throw people in jail, fine them, those types of things, right? Criminal conduct, and we spent a chapter, we'll talk about that, right? Public wrong, court on behalf of the society. One of your assignments, questions is about that, right? Punishment can be this in the United States, certainly not in every nation and not in every state. A certain number of states have banned, the death penalty, and other states, Montana, allows the death penalty, although it's been a long time since we've actually put somebody to death, but a few years anyhow. And no, that's not me. Contract and breach of contract, we spend again another whole chapter talking about that, but it's important. Know this now, that damages arrive from contracts and breaches of contracts, and those damages can be compensatory, meaning that it makes the other person or the other company, other entity whole, okay, the suing entity whole. Okay, they can be consequential, they can be huge, right? Rescissions and specific performance, let's talk about those when we get to contracts. A tort, a civil wrong other than a breach of contract. So torts are what we see a lot of. Okay, torts are what we see a lot of. And what do I mean by that? If you're in a car wreck and you're the person that ran into you, their insurance doesn't want to handle it, and you sue them, that's a tort. Okay. A tort is also when General Motors manufactures a car and the ignition switch doesn't work quite right, and it actually causes some people to have some accidents or suffer bad consequences from accidents. Okay, and so they sue GM. That's a tort. All right, so those types of things are torts, and we see a lot of lawsuits. Volkswagen, building their diesel engines and building them to pass the test even though they couldn't really pass the test, right? And now people are settling and there's all kinds of things going on there. That's tort. These are the three types of tort, and we spend a whole chapter talking about torts. So again, but you might want to know these three. That they are intentional. Somebody intentionally does it. That might be somebody intentionally clocking somebody else, hitting them. Okay, that could be an intentional tort. A negligent tort is, nobody really intended to do it, but it happened. So you don't intend to get in a wreck if you're driving 10 miles over the speed limit, okay, or you didn't intend to hurt somebody when you ran the stop sign, but those can be negligence. And then strict liability. There's certain cases where companies or individuals are held strictly liable for their actions based on that. If BNSF, if their wheels are sparking and it causes a fire, strict liability, right? In tort, there can be compensatory damages, which are designed to make, again, the person whole, just like we had in the breach of contract. But there can also be punitive damages, and those are damages designed to make a statement, make a point. We've had lawsuits against tobacco providers, cigarette makers, and those types of things that oftentimes included huge punitive damages against drug manufacturers when the side effects became rough. Or when the side effects cause problems, sometimes worse than what the drug supposedly cured, right? Violating of statutes and stuff, we kind of had that, right? You can be fined. Injunctions. An injunction is when you're prevented from doing something. The court says you just can't do that. Okay. Seizure and forfeiture of property, there's some cases, and I think I might have some in the discussions that I may or may not leave there, but talk about cases happening with seizure and forfeiture of property, and some of those are a little bit frightening. I think you'll find that when we get there, somebody that's a drug dealer, an out-and-out, no good, rotten drug dealer, that's fine, but there's a lot of cases where people were assumed to be that, and they had things seized from them, okay, and have a devil of a time. May take years and years and years to get those things back, and typically it's money that was seized, and again, there might be some good discussion items about that. So statutory law comes through that comes through the legislature, right? Be comfortable under a business deal. If you knew that the contract you signed would not be or could not be adequately enforced, I would not, right? Legal system, and we spend again a whole chapter talking about corporations, the ownerships, and how those things are. Bingo. Long time, sorry. I got her done a little over half an hour, but that's still longer than I would like to spend probably on these. I'll try to make them a little bit quicker. I hope this helps some of you as you're studying for the test and for the quizzes, etc. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk again soon.